What's up, guys? Mr. Droste here, back to talk about an important set of laws that was passed back in 1850, known as the Compromise of 1850. What did the Compromise of 1850 do? Essentially, it delayed the U.S. Civil War for about 10 years. But at the time, people were pretty satisfied with it in settling some sectional differences that were appearing to potentially pull the U.S. into a civil war in 1850. And this all dealt with the admission of the state of California to the Union. California wanted to be entering the Union as a free state, and Southern states were not cool with that. Why? Because if California came in as a free state in 1850, it would upset the balance between free states and slave states. There would be more U.S. senators coming from free states than the southern slave states. And for obvious reasons, that made the southern slave states very nervous. And so California, like I said, they had applied to become a free state and to gain statehood, and the southern states opposed that. So they started looking at how to appease both sides to avoid civil war, kind of similar to what had happened back in 1820, 30 years earlier with the Missouri Compromise. And the Missouri Compromise essentially kicked the can down the road. It kept a situation where we had a balance of free states and slave states when Maine and Missouri entered the Union, and it applied a rule to all new territories that were going to become states moving forward, where it made the southern border, as you can see up here at the top, the southern border of Missouri, extended that line west, and it said any new states that come in north of that line were not allowed to be slave states, and any new states that would come in south of that line could be slave states. Well, the problem was when that Missouri Compromise was made in 1820, none of this land was part of the United States yet. But now we've had the Mexican War, we've had Oregon coming in via treaty with Great Britain, and of course the Texas Revolution prior to the Mexican War. And so would the Missouri compromise line apply to this new territory? Well, no, it would not. So California wanted to become a free state. As I said, the southern states opposing that. So Henry Clay, the former Speaker of the House, the former multi-time presidential candidate, still in Congress at this time, now a senator from Kentucky, and he starts putting together with his colleagues a series of laws that would deal with the slavery issue and hopefully work out a compromise between North and South. Now, as he started doing this, the president at the time was former General Zachary Taylor, and Zachary Taylor did not support a compromise here. Zachary Taylor passed away. In history, it's been told that he was food poisoned. More likely now, we believe he was poisoned by the water supply at the White House, like William Henry Harrison prior to him. But when he passed away, there was a new president named Millard Fillmore. By the way, Millard Fillmore, dead ringer for actor Alec Baldwin, as you can see right there. But Millard Fillmore supported a compromise. And so Clay and his colleagues began drawing up several bills that they were going to package together. Now, I'm not going to break down all of them. We're going to hit the high points, the most critical parts of the Compromise of 1850. Okay, so number one, California would be admitted as a free state, no questions asked. The territories of Utah and New Mexico, which you see at the top of the screen there in the purple, would be admitted and allowed to vote via popular sovereignty, which is something Senator Stephen Douglas was pushing for. Stephen Douglas, of course, would become very famous for his debates with a candidate for Senate in Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, a few years down the line. But Stephen Douglas at this point was also a very notable U.S. senator, and he was a proponent of popular sovereignty, letting the people in the territories vote on if they wanted slavery. So that's number one. Number two, the slave trade in the capital city of Washington, D.C. would be banned at this point. All right, so Washington, D.C. had slavery. It was a southern city. Washington, D.C. would continue to have slavery after the Compromise of 1850. The difference is slaves were not allowed to be brought into the capital city and sold. However, slaves that were already living in the capital city continued to be sold on the streets of D.C. You know, for representatives and senators who would come to the Capitol from free states, it was very uncomfortable for them to come to Washington, D.C. and see slaves in bondage on the streets being sold. And unfortunately, This part of the compromise, which sounded good on the surface, it really didn't fix that problem. Yes, they couldn't bring in slaves from other areas of the country to sell in the streets of DC, but there continued to be sales on the streets of DC. There continued to be slaves being hauled around in bondage on the streets of DC in the nation's capital. But that was part of the Compromise of 1850. And most importantly, and probably the biggest legacy of the Compromise of 1850, because this is going to lead to a lot of Northern anger, is a more comprehensive Fugitive Slave Act. So there already was a Fugitive Slave Act prior to this. The southern states wanted the northern states to be more active. They wanted the federal government to mandate that northern authorities and even northern citizens take part in returning escaped slaves to the South. So through this new Fugitive Slave Act, citizens, private citizens in free states could be compelled to help return runaway slaves to southern slave states. Very controversial because more and more people are becoming aware of the evils of slavery through things like Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. The abolitionist movement is growing, and they feel as though they don't want to enforce that. Northern authorities, too, had to be compelled to return runaway slaves, or they could face fines or even prison time. So this was very, very controversial. And one thing I want to point out is that there has often been this narrative in American history that the U.S. Civil War was solely about states' rights. The southern states, 10 years before the Civil War, actually did not believe in states' rights and their ability to nullify federal code or ignore federal code. Because at this moment in time, with the Fugitive Slave Act, the southern states insisted that the northern states obey the federal code that was this new, more harsh Fugitive Slave Act. So very, very controversial. And in the end, I mean, it's one of those things that's going to continue to rile up more Northerners, draw more people to the abolitionist movement, raise more awareness to the evils of slavery, and eventually, of course, in 1861, the breaking out of the American Civil War. So what happened in those territories of New Mexico and Utah? So New Mexico and Utah, eventually there were slaves in both territories. They passed slave codes, which essentially protected slavery in the territories. They didn't have the amount of slavery that the Deep South had or anything like that. And especially if you look at New Mexico was enslaving Native Americans. But African slavery did exist in both the Utah territory and the New Mexico territory moving forward, following the Compromise of 1850, until we finally had the 13th Amendment passed in 1865. So that's the basics of the Compromise of 1850. Hopefully that helped you out if you're studying for a test, or if just you're interested in American history. And if you want more great videos on American history, please subscribe to the channel. You see it in the bottom right hand corner in the video here, or you can click that subscribe button down below the video feed. And if you like this video, click that thumbs up button. It would help out the channel a lot. Greatly appreciate it. We'll see you back here next time.